So Europe in the year 1500, okay? And Europe in the year 1500 is still, so the thing that has changed at the end of the Middle Ages is that a few places have become more centralized. The Franks were the first ones to create a central. Franks were some of the barbarians that came from Germany. The original language, they came from Aachen, which is now in Germany. So some of them become what today we call nations. You know, so there's an extensive territory. But look at Germany and look at Italy. Okay, this is still medieval. This literally we don't know how many. But somewhere I found 160 states in Germany, and Italy depends on the day of the week. There were continuous wars between different princes in Italy. So that's Europe in 1500. Now 1500 something has already happened that I actually still have to talk about. So one important thing that happened, so when do the Dark Ages end? It really depends which event we want to pick. But in this century, and between 1450 and 15 something, a lot of big things happen. So one is the fall of Byzantium, which is now called Istanbul, because it fell. So when the Ottomans take Constantinople / Byzantium, now Istanbul, in 1453, that sends shockwaves throughout Europe. It's like the fall of Rome. I mean, that has become the capital of Christianity. That has become the biggest Christian power. And it falls to the Muslims. And that sends different kinds of shockwaves. Some of them are not trivial. Like, to this day, the Russians think that now they are the defenders of Christianity. Because that's what happened back then. Russia was just emerging, and eventually Russia became the main power fighting the Ottomans. So from their point of view, their psyche is being built. We defended Christianity against the Muslims who were, you know. So some of them are subtle. Another subtle thing is that a lot of Greek, when this was Greece, a lot of Greek intellectuals left Byzantium, now Istanbul, and migrated to places like Italy. And they brought with them culture. They knew how to read and write. Those were still, even during the middle, that part of the world did not have the Dark Ages. Okay? The Byzantine Empire was still a highly literate empire by the standards of back then. So a lot of these intellectuals fled towards Western Europe. That had an impact. I will tell you in a little bit. Now, Muslims generally were expanding and attacking Europe. The first major hit had been Spain, Sicily, but Spain was the big one. And so they took most of Spain. 1492 is when one of the kingdoms of Spain reconquers Spain, what is now Spain. That's the Kingdom of Castilla. And those are the people who funded Columbus' travel to America. And so it's not a coincidence that year Columbus also travels to America and rediscovers America. We don't know how many times we discovered America, starting from Stone Age. Needless to say, both very important events. The first one was psychological. We expelled the Muslims from Western Europe. And the second one will have a huge economic impact, of course, today. We are the consequences of that event. Now, 1517, Martin Luther starts the Reformation. So the Western Christian church splits. Okay, we already have, at this point, we already have at least 3 splits, basically, because the Rome and Byzantium split way back. Okay, then Rome fell to the barbarians, so Byzantium remained the only credible capital of Christianity. But then Byzantium also fell. So then Russia says, we are the Orthodox Christians. So at this point you have 2 Orthodox Christians. The Greek Orthodox Christians and the Russian Orthodox Christians to this day. And then in the West you have a split between what is now called the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. And that has huge repercussions in Europe. Few years later, you have the beginning of the wars of religion, probably the most stupid wars ever fought in Europe before World War I, where countries, big and small, start fighting each other for about 120 years. There's endless wars of religion in Europe, with who knows how many hundreds of thousands of people killed, all in the name of God. The same God, by the way. Another thing that is happening here is that this dynasty from Austria, the Habsburg, through sometimes through war, but mostly through just alliances, marriages, they become the biggest power in Central and Western Europe. Spain, of course, the American colonies of Spain, Southern Italy, Austria, Netherlands are all under the same emperor, Carl V. Of course, you have the Spanish conquistador in Mexico and Peru, so it's the beginning of the colonization of the Americas. Europeans begin traveling by sea to the Far East, and that's important, of course. That's the beginning of, and by the way, a very small country travels all the way to China, India, China, many other places. Eventually Holland goes to Indonesia and so on. And that's the beginning, of course, of European domination of the Far East. And for us, this is also important, the English Pilgrims of the Mayflower. And the biggest war of this period is the 30 Years' War, where France, England, and Sweden win against Austria and Spain. Austria and Spain are these guys. And that's important because up to here, between the unification and the 30 Years' War, Spain has become the power in Europe. The first major European power, Spain. And with this war that ends, France becomes the new major power. And that will last until Napoleon, basically. Of course, there was never absolute supremacy. It's not like the United States today that is superpower, okay? But Spain was the richest, more powerful, best army, ruled over huge territory. After that war, its territory shrinks, and it has a major defeat in that war that shows that its navy is not that great. So, yeah, same thing. Now, meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, what you have is the Ottoman expansion. This is the Ottoman Empire at its peak, basically. The Ottomans are stopped just before Vienna. And so if you have friends from Poland, they will tell you, we saved Europe, because it was the Polish cavalry that went to save Vienna, which was Austria. You know, it's a long story. But, so they almost conquered Western Europe. And after that moment, they really start losing more and more territory in Europe, mostly. But there's endless wars between the Ottomans and Austria, and the Ottomans and Russia. Austria was a big empire here, and Russia was becoming a big empire there. So those three empires fought endless wars. Yeah, 100-year war between Austria and Ottoman Empire, countless battles. Now, extend further the zoom out, and what you see is four empires that are born at that time. What they have in common, they call them the Gunpowder Empires, because they use artillery, they use the cannon, and they become regional powers, significant regional powers. So the Ottoman is one, the Russian is another one, and these two are interesting. So the Safavid are the new dynasty in Iran. They are the ones that really make Iran Muslim. Okay, there was massive persecution of non-Muslims in Iran. Until that day, Iran has been multi-religious, Zoroastrian. That's where Zoroaster came from. So there were a lot of Zoroastrian. After this dynasty, very few left. And the Mughal are Muslims. They come from Central Asia. They occupy, at one point, they occupy even more than this of India, one of the major political entities of India before the British conquered it. But these two are interesting because they are cosmopolitan, and we like melting pots. And these were melting pots. The Ottoman Empire, people forget, the Ottoman Empire went down in World War I. But before that, it was actually an interesting empire. It was an experiment because, first of all, there were a lot of Christians and Jews in the Ottoman Empire, a lot. And a lot of them were rich, powerful. A lot of Ottoman emperors married Christian princesses. So it was a very tolerant place. Istanbul was the largest city in Europe in the 15th, 16th century. Melting pot of races, languages, religions. To this day, if you go to Istanbul, there's an area that's called the Italian area. So Genoa was actually Genoa, one specific city-state. You know, they were living there. Italians were living there, trading and so on. So that's the Ottoman Empire. And the other one, yeah, and again, at this point, Islam is still ahead. Okay, at this point, Islamic world. They took over the Arabs and their culture, and those are the traditional Greek areas. So it's still, today it's hard to focus, but that part of the world, Middle East, Greece, Turkey, North Africa, was a very vibrant place. Where's Athens at this point? Ottoman. Where's Alexandria at this point? Ottoman. Where's Jerusalem? Ottoman. Whereas Antioch, it was a very important Syrian city, Ottoman, okay? So no wonder they're still ahead of Europe in many of these things. The other one is Russia. Russia is interesting because culturally it's almost the opposite. Russia is really behind. It will remain behind. No Reformation, no Industrial Revolution, no Scientific Revolution, until really communism, I think. So Russia is the opposite from that point of view, but in terms of melting pot, they also qualify because they had Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, pagans, you name it. As they expanded, they incorporated more and more of non-Christian, non-Slavs in their empire. And as I said, psychologically, they claim to be heir to Byzantium after Byzantium fell. So basically the third Rome, Rome, Byzantium, Moscow. That's all Kiev originally. So these two empires are kind of interesting because they were experiments. And one of them survives to this day, actually. Russia still is a melting pot of races, religions, and languages. Now, if you look at Europe without Russia, there's a mystery there. I mean, everything I told you so far shows that Europe was just a big mess. Islam was ahead, China was ahead, there were much bigger empires, even the Safavid Empire was much bigger than anything in Europe. So how did these people end up ruling the world? That's the big mystery, right? It was a disunited Europe, so it was a lot of fragmentation, a lot of wars within Europe. Forget the wars with Islam, just the wars inside Europe were devastating. Some of them, the 30-year war, I don't know if I had it on the slide, they say that it caused the death of 1/3 of the population of Europe. Warfare and famine and disease and whatever else. It entered the 16th century behind the other regions of behind the Middle East, behind China, in science, philosophy, technology, and it had fewer people and resources than the Asian empires. So why these people ended up ruling the world? And so, yeah, even a small country like Portugal eventually achieved conquest on a scale that China never achieved. At one point, Portugal had colonies all over Africa. Angola and Mozambique still speak Portuguese to this day. They had colonies in India, Sri Lanka, all the way to China. And of course, they had Brazil, which to this day speaks Portuguese. So how did it happen that very teeny countries constantly at war with their neighbors ended up building huge empires? And of course, there's no simple explanation, but certainly one reason is competition. You know, the Chinese had no competition. They had no motivation to have the best army in the world. Who were they fighting? The Europeans did. The Europeans did. They were constantly at war. So the motivation to become better and better in warfare, which implies in technology, which implies in organization, and so on, was very, very strong in Europe. So ironically, the fact that Europe was a mess might have helped create what others didn't have, create an extremely competitive world where technology was valued, and people had to use their brain in a way that others didn't have to. But of course, I'm being very superficial here. I mean, thick books have been written to try to explain what happened. And some of it could be just accidental. So that's Portugal. That's just to give you an idea. A small country actually pioneered the colonization of the Istrios. They were the first ones to go around, find a sea route. See, even this, it's funny. I said that the Ottomans indirectly caused the ripples that had all sorts of consequences. Well, one reason why the Europeans wanted to do this is that the Ottomans had created a bottleneck here. It became harder for Europeans to trade with the Far East, which was a very lucrative business. So the Ottomans indirectly sent the Italian city-states bankrupt. Venice and Genoa lived on this trade. Suddenly it became very complicated. Indirectly, they told the Europeans, find another way to trade with these guys. And the other way is to go around Africa. So the Portuguese eventually learned how to do it. They tried, eventually they made it. Unfortunately, the Europeans had virtually nothing to sell. They wanted to buy, but they had nothing to sell. The same problem the Italian city-states had. You know, what do we give the Chinese and the Indians in return? So what the Portuguese did, when they came here, they didn't trade. They just occupied, killed, and looted. And that became the standard of European colonization. It really starts from that fact. Anyway, so in Europe, which countries really developed to the point that you can say, well, at least this country got out of the Middle Ages? Well, France is definitely one, and as I said, eventually became the regional power. Richelieu was a cardinal. It's interesting, in one of the portraits is pictured writing, which in the Middle Ages, writing was not valued. To me, that's psychology is important. To me, something has happened there. They picture him writing. This guy is a smart guy. He knows how to read and write. Anyway. And he's credited with founding the absolute monarchy. You know, Machiavelli in Italy had preached about the absolutist power and so on. Richelieu implemented it. So France becomes an absolute monarchy where the king is absolute power of the rest of the country. No more feudalism at this point. Forget the vassals or whatever. There's one guy in charge. He has power. He uses terror to keep the power and enforce his rules over the country. Okay? France has become a real state, not just a federation of counts and barons. He believed in technology. So he had learned the lessons I was talking about from the Middle Ages. He had learned that technology is valuable. And of course, he had also learned it from wars, you know, the importance of having the best weapons. And so he introduced this idea of a technocratic state. He reorganized education. He founded under his watch was founded the French Academy. So for better for worse, he really changed the idea of what a state is in Europe. The other place that was emerging was England. Now England had been really negligible in the history of Europe for a long time. As you probably know, it was invaded by the Saxons, by the Vikings, before that by the Romans. The Romans at one point stopped, and my British friends say, well, we stopped them. Well, actually, the Romans didn't see the point of keeping a land that had absolutely nothing. then a number of things happened here that changed things, and you know, in retrospect, we can say these were important events. So 1536, that's after the Reformation. One thing that happens in England, and pretty much only in England to this extent, is the dissolution of the monasteries. England had at that point, I think, 825 monasteries. They, like everywhere in Europe, they owned a lot of the productive land and mines and, you know, rivers, and so the crown takes them, confiscates, and then gives them to what today we would call capitalist landowners, who start doing something else with those resources. And that creates a big difference with the rest of Europe, where either the church still rules, or it's the king who owns everything. It creates a big difference in who funds industry, who funds commerce. Okay, in England it is not. At some point, it's definitely not the king. Anyway, I'm going ahead myself. The reign of Elizabeth I is not only important for theater, but that's also a signal that at that point England suddenly has great poets and playwrights. It was an age of peace by the standards of Europe. Continental Europe was engulfed in those religious wars non-stop, and England was largely immune from all of that. And that probably had a beneficial effect on the development of the economy. It is actually that time that there's the first boom of iron and coal. Of course, it will be much bigger later when we get into the steam engine and so on. But that's when England finds out it's mostly deforested, so it can't really use wood anymore. It has to start using something else. So the something else is coal, and then you start seeing more and more people digging coal. And also England becomes one of the main places for the iron industry. Back then, most utensils were wood, and I guess historians like to differentiate Europe, where iron was used for luxury, was quality industry. In England, it gets used to build ordinary domestic things, it's quantity. So Europe, continental Europe was quality, craftsmanship. England was just quantity. Of course, the way I'm explaining it, it's biased. I'm already trying to make you think in terms of the Industrial Revolution, right? But that's really the foundations are probably there in that period. Then the glorious English Revolution. So if you put together the fact that the church was losing power, even the Anglican church was losing power. The Anglican church never replaced the Roman church in terms of power. So then there's the glorious English Revolution and some other facts. And the end, at the end, what you have is a decline at the same time of the church and of the crown. They both lose power. So in that vacuum of power, who prospers? Well, that's a difficult thing to answer in a few words, but maybe that's the vacuum of power explains why the British were the first ones to rediscover capitalism of the Italian city-states. You know, that kind of free market and entrepreneurship. You know, and just starting businesses. France, Spain, the rest of Europe. In most of the rest of Europe, there was the king was really the one who owned the country and owned also the investment, owned the industry, owned the technology. The two exceptions were Britain and Holland. Here I say Dutch-style market economy because the Italian city-states at that point, you know, were dying, declining very rapidly. But the Dutch city-states were still vibrant, and Holland got united started getting united in 1648. Even once it got united, it was still a federation of this very vibrant. So there was another place where there was a vacuum of power. There was no dictator. Once they got rid of the Habsburgs, there was no dictator in the modern sense. And so both England and Holland, for different historical reasons, gave, let's call it the middle class, more freedom. Okay. By the way, women. You see a lot of women who have a lot of power. You know.
How?
Huh?
How?
Well, that's a good question. In my opinion, the Middle Ages were not terribly bad for women. It just Middle Ages, everybody was poor and desperate. So, and yeah, you come out of the Middle Ages, and a lot of women have power. They become queens, and there's also women in science. The first women in science, the first women in literature, and 1 century later, it's women who run the salons of France, where the Enlightenment is nurtured. So, yeah, the question should be the opposite. Why wasn't it like this way back, right? And so anyway, and you will have more. I mean, eventually you will have Katerina of Russia. So, as I mentioned, the Islamic conquest of Constantinople had ripple effects. And one effect I already mentioned was to motivate Christian Europe to look for a different route to the Far East. And so you have these are the great explorers, right? Diaz, Columbus, Caboto, Gama, and Magellan, who, using technology and just brains, they managed to find ways to travel, circumnavigate, go around the Cape in Africa and reach Asia, and travel to the Pacific Ocean all the way to America. That's another good question. Why it happened back then? Yeah, it's a good question, because there were technological inventions during the Middle Ages that made it possible, but all of a sudden there's this boom of movement. And as I said, one trigger is certainly the fact that the Ottomans caused a major economic problem. So the Europeans had to go around it. But it's amazing that within a few years, they seem to find a solution and start doing it. This map I posted, this is the earliest map of the entire America. I don't know if it is this map, no, not this map. There's another map that's kind of funny because it shows a little bit of the North America, and where we are now, California, it just says not yet discovered. Mm-hmm. So it's ... Yeah, this one. It's a French one, not yet discovered. Is there one? I don't know if you can read it. That's us. So, rise of Portugal, for the reason already explained. Portugal is not an accident because it's all the way to the west, so it's the nearest to the ocean. Okay, everybody else had to cross the Mediterranean, they were right there. Decline of the Italian city-states and decline of Alexandria. Alexandria kept repeating. When we talk about Hellenistic culture, Alexandria was one of the main Hellenistic capitals. It was also one of the main capitals of Christianity. A lot of the early bishops and popes were from Alexandria, actually. And that's the beginning of the decline of Alexandria. The economy always plays a big role. Alexandria was one of the beneficiaries of medieval trade. And again, once the Ottomans take over the economic center of the Ottoman Empire, shifts to Istanbul, obviously. And Alexandria loses whatever importance it had in those trade routes that started from Italy going south. So the other country that benefited a lot is Holland, which again wasn't even a country until 1648. But they eventually, it's another small country that eventually, well, this I'm fast forwarding a couple of centuries, but eventually they do business with Malaysia, China, Burma, Thailand. They invade Sumatra, Java, Borneo. This becomes Indonesia. It's a very small country. It was a very small country with a big empire. In 2 weeks, I'm going to Suriname in South America, where they speak Dutch. It was a Dutch colony. Another Dutch colony was which city, which is one of the biggest cities, it is the biggest city in North America? New Amsterdam?
Oh, New York.
New York. Yeah, and they had, as I mentioned, most sophisticated capitalism came out of Holland. It's always kind of funny, because if you think of Mesopotamia, Greece, this was, even Italy in the Middle Ages, these were anarchic places. Places where there's a vacuum of power, essentially. But then a lot of big things happen in those places. So you have the first corporations. The most famous will become the East India Company in England and the Dutch East India Company in Holland. Those were private corporations. France didn't have these things. France, the king owned the country. Big difference. Britain and Holland were the exception. The only places where you have the major private corporations, and they are the ones that conquered physically. India was not a British colony at the beginning. Yeah, Spanish and Portuguese explorers colonized in the name of their monarchs. You know? British and Dutch explorers colonized in the name of profit. So it was a different, because this was private. These were in the service of the king. They were just trying to expand the Spanish Empire. But this was not the British Empire trying to expand. There was no British Empire at the time. It was just private companies trying to make money. Not always in a very Christian way, but the goal was profit, okay? And trivia, the future territory of the United States was ignored by pretty much everybody. There was really not much that they wanted. They didn't find any gold, any silver, and didn't find any sugar, which is coming up. So Spain and England developed their colonies in a totally different way. And I don't want to do this because it's a long story. But even in the way they settled, I mean, the Spanish sent men because they were conquering that place. And instead, England didn't send anybody, just families went. You know, England did not send pilgrims or criminals or whatever. They just came, and they came with families. So even the way they colonized the future colonies, from the beginning, they were very different. Now, the American colonies made a huge difference in Europe. The difference for Spain actually was not entirely good news. Spain initially, of course, profited from gold and silver, but that ended up causing inflation. The royal family overspent. Eventually, Spain had the biggest debt ever seen in the history of Europe. Eventually went bankrupt. One reason why it lost that important war is that it was already in debt. So it was mixed blessings. Sometimes finding a gold mine is not necessarily good news. But from the point of view of agriculture, think of it.